So thanks everybody for coming. Hope this is going to be a good time for you, and you'll have a little bit of time to, depending on what part of the world you're in. If you're in the US, and you can eat your lunch and listen to me talk about purple teaming for the first little bit. And then from there, you're going to get your own lab and hands-on time. So we'll go over everything. If you've been on one of these before, then welcome back. Happy to have you. Glad that you enjoyed your previous sessions enough to come join us again. And for those of you that haven't been to a Purple Team workshop before, welcome. We're super excited you're here to listen and learn about what purple teaming is. And like I said, we'll get started. All right. Yes. So a couple of things to tackle right off the bat. And I will say this again, these slides will be shared afterwards. So you don't have to worry about taking too many notes unless there's something I say that's not on the slides that you want to retain. But other than that, these are also recorded. And so you will have access to them. SCYTHE does have a YouTube channel, and we will be posting it there so you can watch it as many times as you want afterward. So don't worry about that. The key thing here is I want you all to learn about purple teaming, take some notes if you want, but all of this stuff will be there after, again, for you all to leverage afterwards. So don't worry about that. And we'll give it like another minute, and then we'll get started. Right. So for those of you that are in the chat here, it will say welcome, and you should have, I think, there should be some emails going out that you should get from VMware Learning Platform. That's the infrastructure and sort of class lab infrastructure we use for these Purple Team workshops. So if you haven't gotten that email, give it a few more minutes. And when I start talking about how exactly this is structured, I'll go over it one more time. And so if you don't have a link, something like that, I'll ask that you say something in the chat, send it to the panelists. And I've got an awesome team of other SCYTHE employees to help me out while I'm presenting so that they can tackle some of those, any challenges or issues you might have getting access to the lab. But we do have about probably 45 minutes to an hour of lecture before we jump into the lab. So that's just something, if you didn't get it, don't worry, you're not going to fall behind or anything like that. And I definitely want to make sure that we have as many people can take this as possible. So let me get one more sip of water. So the VMware environment will be accessible through the workshop time. So 3 hours essentially starting now. And after that, it is going to be terminated. So it does cost us money to host those labs. So that's why it's not frankly open for like 24 hours or something like that, is that we do host these workshops at least monthly. And so if for some reason you don't get through all of it in this time, you can always join us again. Or if you want to spend some more time playing with SCYTHE, for instance, that's, I'd invite you to come to another workshop. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome again to anybody that joined late to not late, we're just getting started, to the hands-on Purple Team workshop. So I'm Tim Schulz. If you're unsure of who I am, that's a picture of me eating a 5-pound chocolate bar. And yes, I did finish the entire thing, but not in one sitting. So I'm SCYTHE's Adversary Emulation Lead. Prior to that, I was at a couple other places that federally funded research and development centers, which basically just means that it's a lot of places that did researching, test and evaluation. And that's sort of what brought me into red teaming and purple teaming now. So you may have heard of some of these. Most people are familiar with MITRE and MITRE Attack. I was part of those teams, as well as worked for a number of years at Sandia National Labs, which also does a lot of cool work. So with that, let's dive right in. Hands-on workshop format. So I did mention, and you probably saw on any of the posts that you clicked when you registered, this is a hands-on workshop. I mentioned before, this is in VMware Learning Platform. You should have received an email that says your lab has been provisioned. Click on this link. If you click on it, you're going to get this pop-up that's going to ask you what class to choose. Just click X on it. You don't have to worry about it. If you do accidentally click something and it's not working, then yeah, let us know. Send us a chat. So we do have other folks from the site team that are standing by. Shout out to Elaine for helping me through this. She's our head of support, and she's going to be answering any questions in chats or helping any people that didn't get it to their emails. I think I did see one person that registered an email and instead of it going to .com, it went to .con. And so either it's a really well-crafted phishing email or they accidentally typed in an N instead of an M, which I have been guilty of doing on many occasions. So something I'll just mention from that, if you didn't get it, please post in Q&A so that we can track that. Elaine's typing stuff out in the chat too. So anything she tells you overrides what I say. So listen to her. She's the one that knows this and has she's been troubleshooting many a workshop problem. So with that, after you get the link, we are going to have a lecture to introduce some key concepts around purple teaming, how we do purple teaming here at SCYTHE, and how we teach purple teaming. We have 3 hours of total time to play in the lab environment. As I mentioned before, there's a self-paced manual. It is very detailed, and so you should be able to walk through some of it yourself. However, if you don't want to just walk through it yourself, you want someone to sort of guide you through it. That's where I come into. After the lecture portion, I'm going to be helping drive and going through an example, answering any questions, things like that. So the entire time is not going to be lecture. What it tends to be is the first hour is the lecture and purple team intro format. And then we go into, I tackle small parts of the lab at a time, give you some time to also do it on your own. And that will take up the rest of the probably an hour and a half, 2 hours. So, and of course, if you want, if you're like an old hat at this, you already know how to go through these things, you know about purple teaming already, maybe you've been to a workshop before, you can jump straight into the lab environment, throw me on mute. I promise I won't be offended, and play around with the lab environment we set up for you. So we do have a couple systems in the lab environment. We'll get more into those later. This is just sort of a big overview, but the key thing that we've got here is we've got, of course, SCYTHE for you to play with, as well as some setups with the Sand Slingshot VM, which is an open source VM. You can go download it yourself. It's the C2 Matrix edition, which we'll also talk about the C2 Matrix, but what it really means is it's got a lot of open source tooling already set up. So you can play with that on your own time too. I always recommend folks that play around with SCYTHE while you have access to it here, because it's not open source and you're not going to get to play with it after these 3 hours unless you purchase it. So with that, let's keep rolling. The key things I really want you to take away from purple teaming is the concepts behind it, how you can take the value that purple teaming brings, which of course we're going to dive into, and how you can bring it back into your own work. Regardless of your current role, you can apply some form of purple teaming to it. I promise. Whether it's even doing, the examples we'll give will be a very specific command or something like that that's linked to like an adversary behavior. But depending on what part of the stack you're in either technology or strategy, those types of things, we've got a lot of different touch points with purple teaming. Purple teaming is really about sort of a mindset and applying that mindset to specific parts of information security or different parts of your organization. So that's really what I want you to take away is how to think through it, how to tackle problems, the purple way. And we're going to equip you with as much as we can to at least do it in the enterprise security model, as well as doing a little bit of strategic planning with the SCYTHE, the purple team maturity model. And of course, you are going to get CPE credits for showing up, and that'll be at the end of the lab that you can download those. All right, let's jump right in. Talk about what is purple teaming. So this is something that I like to at least give a little bit of history, because people that are newer to the space or haven't really been tracking things are wondering, how did we get to purple teaming? Don't we have blue team? Don't we have red team? What's moved us towards purple? So back before, you can argue whether, the chicken or the egg, what came first, the defender or the attacker. And so for the most part, most teams have had security operations centers, blue teams, And organizations are slowly have been shifting towards adding red, and whether or not that red team is part of compliance or trying to fulfill some requirement of test and evaluation before a new product goes out, that's typically how red teams have been introduced. And so what that means is that red teams are typically a barrier for people to hit. And so there tends to be a little bit of head to head, a little bit of fighting, and it's sort of an adversarial relationship. And part of that has been because a lot of times red teamers are very creative people. They have to come up with ways to get past systems. And then on the blue team side, you have people that are building and securing these systems, which is a really hard job. It's hard to build something that's secure. We see all of these 0 days and things coming out in 2021 that even some of the best companies and teams in the world, they still have introduced vulnerabilities, and that happens. And so that there tends to be a little bit of disconnect there between what is the overall goal of each of those teams. Now, besides that, and there are some organizations that have really healthy security cultures, even between red and blue. And that's excuse me, where we really get to, we started to introduce purple teaming through something that is the third key part of a purple team, which is cyber threat intelligence. So cyber threat intelligence really came about over the last decade, I would say. Before we had like that APT1 report that came out a little over 10 years ago. And that was the first really public report. Everyone had talked about it behind the scenes. If you talk to some people that had worked either in government agencies, things like that, but cyber threat intelligence and the reports that have been published for everyone to read and analyze, and the information that's been in those has really provided a lot of really interesting context to both blue teams and red teams. From the blue team side of things, your cyber threat intelligence can link things to attacks. Potentially, you can do attribution. There's all sorts of other different nuances that you can add to your data. So it's who is attacking us, what type of adversaries are we worried about. There's a lot of that information. And from the red team perspective, the cyber threat intelligence provides all of the different avenues by which real adversaries are able to either have successful campaigns, maybe what's not working for them as well. And so that allows us to either scope red team and scope these tests for the blue team to make it more relevant to the organization. And so that's really what it comes down to. Purple teaming is the combination of these three skill sets all into a singular exercise. And then later on, we'll talk about it as part of a team. So why do purple team? I mean, some people might ask, isn't red team sort of already doing this job? Well, part of the challenge is a lot of red teams come in and they are doing something as either blind or as with no knowledge beforehand. And so that's something that can be really difficult. Purple team or red team engagements can sometimes take weeks to months to do for the entire scope that they've been hired or agreed to. And that's where purple teaming is much more deliberate. And so that's where a couple of the key points I want to hit on here is it can train the organization's defenders. As you'll see when we go through all of the purple team processes, it's about transparency. It's about showing exactly what types of techniques adversaries are using. It's about talking to why those techniques are successful and why they are able to be detected or not. Those are the types of things that we're really looking at with a purple team. And so it's sort of an education campaign and sort of shining a light on otherwise what would be sort of masked or obscure adversary capabilities and behaviors. And so we're bringing a light to those. And I think that's something that's really key. Now, testing the processes between security teams. This is something that another thing that shines with purple teams, and that transparency. I'm going to keep coming back to that because it's so important, is that purple teaming, especially the way we do it and the way that I'll outline, test the people, the process, and the technologies. And so with that, we talk a lot about technologies, and that tends to be the focus. Even of red teams, maybe you test the people a little bit if you do like social engineering engagements, that kind of thing. But as part of purple teaming, we also want to test the processes between teams. For instance, if there's a multi-tier SOC, you have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. We have a process, or is there an outlined process for how to escalate between those teams? And that becomes something that we go through in purple teaming, is trying to evaluate what is that the information that would trigger that escalation from tier 1 to tier 2 and tier 2 to tier 3. And we follow that process as we're going through a purple team engagement. Testing attack chains and TTPs that have not been tested before. This is something where it brings in a little bit more red side of things to the purple team. You get red teamers have a lot of curiosity. They want to try different things and see if they work. In a purple team environment, you're essentially doing it with this, again, transparent methodology. So the blue teams can see exactly what's happening. They can maybe provide additional info about what works and what doesn't and why, because they have a potentially greater understanding of how all of the security stack, how all of those vendors are supposed to work together. And then you can test those things to see how they work. Now we'll talk about how you scope these types of tests, but this is another really good way to build some collaboration between teams. And that's really what I want to hit at the bottom is we're trying to foster a collaborative environment, because everything around purple teaming is about collaboration. It's about communication. And so you're going to see that as we talk through all of the different purple team activities. With that, what is a purple team exercise? Overall, it's got all those different roles. You have blue team, red team, CTI, and we're going to walk through exactly all of the different steps. So the key thing here is that there is a methodology. There is a series of steps that you can follow to the T. When I do purple team services for SCYTHE, which I am our services lead. So I do these things potentially, every week or even every few days, depending on how busy we are. And that's something that I follow this to the T. We go through and we're trying to transition this capability to others too, because purple teaming, we've seen such a huge, it's been every team we've done it for has been really receptive to it. And I think that's what's been really powerful about purple teaming is you can showcase exactly what defenses were made better and improved based on the purple team exercises. And you'll see those metrics, and we'll talk about those a little bit as well. But overall, again, people, process, and technology. You got to tackle all three when you're trying to tackle the entire holistic defense of an organization in cybersecurity. All right. So the first thing I like to talk about is a success story. Everyone likes a good success story. And it's like, what can purple teaming bring to me? So SCYTHE, we were nice enough to be able to work with the National Motor Freight Traffic Association, NMFTA. Say that 5 times fast. And so they were really nice in that not only could we work with them, they allowed attribution for what we're talking about today. And there's been a lot of really great outcomes because of this. So we did a 6-week purple team exercise. There's an assumed breach scenario. So the adversary is assumed to have gotten in some way, whether it's an insider threat, whether it is a 0-day, as we've seen, unfortunately, a lot of in 2021, or some other scenario, somebody clicked on a phishing email and the adversary was able to get an initial foothold. And the question that happens next is what can we detect from there? And so we were hired to perform all 3 roles, both all being red, blue, and cyber threat intelligence. So what that means is that we had to scope what the tests were going to be. That's the cyber threat intelligence part. We had to create the test. That's the red team part. And then we also had to write detections and build that out. And that's the blue team part. And so we couldn't spend any money on new technology. We had to only tune the current security controls and what was used. So that was sort of the challenge. And this is where purple teaming can really shine. So as far as scoping the threats, to make sure, since we're the ones that are building our own detections and everything, we need to make sure that we weren't over engineering specific detections to specific tests that we were building. And so as part of that, we outlined first, here's 6 different weeks of testing of what we're going to do. And the first week was going to be some baseline testing just to see what access do we have from that initial machine and that foothold that we've gotten from the assumed breach scenario. Will our C2 work? And is the C2 we're using? You can do some network testing controls there, and then understanding the endpoint controls. Lots of organizations have EDRs now. They have different SIM setups. And so trying to understand how all of those mixed together was really what we were trying to do the first week. And then from there, we outlined 4 different adversaries of increasing sophistication. And oftentimes this relates to how much operational security they were concerned about, as well as the different technological techniques that they leverage. For an easy example is command line versus PowerShell. PowerShell being a little bit more difficult for teams to detect because it's used in more legitimate use cases these days. And so that's the type of thing that we're looking at when trying to change things up. And so at the very end, the last week, it was the red team basically had free play based on previous weeks. They knew what worked, they knew what didn't, they could try new things out. Everything has to be linked back to what real adversaries are doing. And so that's what we did with this sort of initial outline. And so a lot of times with purple team engagements, the first run is pretty rough. It tends to be folks have a lot of expectations from their current tooling. And part of it is a lot of times it does not meet up, unfortunately. A lot of it is either tuning. It's not necessarily the tools themselves, but trying to adjust it to work in the current environment. And so 94% of adversary behavior was undetected after the first run. I think there was some initial PowerShell execution that did get blocked by one of the defensive products. And that's where you see you have your little slivers of green and blue in there. But overall, this was a pretty rough start. So what did we do? After 6 weeks, we enabled additional telemetry through Sysmon. We were working with Event Sentry, which is not free, but it is a SIM that was there and deployed. And sort of a really cool after blog was Event Sentry actually released the detections that we wrote as part of this, and you can see them. I think I've got a link for the blog on the next slide. But overall, Event Sentry, we wrote all these detections in it, and this is what we got to: 64% increase in detections after 6 weeks. Now, how many different exercises or how many different ways can you measure that and say that after you've done some security testing? There's not a whole lot of different ways that can be achieved without having essentially what is a purple team. And so that's why I like to showcase these slides up front. This is what we're going towards. This is the ideal scenario, is that you can get to and have these drastic results or dramatic results. And it's not going to be this way every time, because this was an entire thing. We got 6 weeks. You probably aren't going to get that, and that's okay. But purple teaming can still be a huge boon for your organization and for your team, because you can bring this type of change. And the fact that you can measure the change that happens over time is really going to help demonstrate how good purple teaming has been in implementing it. So with that, this was from the talk, the full purple juice, not the watered down stuff, by George and Bryson from CactusCon of this last year. And so got a YouTube link there. Feel free to watch it. It's about 50 minutes. It's a really, really good talk. And this is always one of the first things I send to people when they ask, like, what can purple teaming do for me? So instead of me just talking about it, they've got the data, they give the breakdown. And so I really want to encourage you all to go and look at that as sort of, homework, so to speak. So with that, let's move towards what a purple team is. All right. So purple team exercise checklist. We have 3 major things. We need an exercise framework. We need cyber threat intelligence and an emulation plan. And then we actually need like tools to help us do these things, because those are the types of tools we need in order to speed this up. Because it's manual processes are great, but when you're trying to scale those things, you got to try and use tools to help you out. So let's talk about overall a framework and methodology. There's a bunch of different ones out there. I'm not going to say that SCYTHE has the only way to do purple teaming. There's a bunch of different methodologies that are out there that are common, that may already be in use at your organization. And so if you're not going to get traction trying to build a new methodology or use a new methodology, I'd say stick with what you have and figure out how purple teaming can apply in that. So most folks are familiar with the cyber kill chain. It's made popular by Lockheed Martin. We also have the unified cyber kill chain, which tackles some of the challenges that and the gaps that people saw in the initial cyber kill chain. And so there's a bunch of industry specific ones as well. Overall, we have the purple team exercise framework. You can go download it. We just call it PTEF. And so it's scythe.io/PTEF. You can go download it, but I'll be walking through it anyway. So you don't have to download it. You can follow along if you want, but it is a really nice document that walks through exactly all of the things you need. So starting off, and my slides are lagging just slightly. There we go. So One of the challenges, so George and Bryson, credit to them and for building out the Purple Team exercise framework, because George has had a lot of experience building out different standards and frameworks. And one of the challenges we always hear when people are trying to bring in new things is, how do I operationalize it? How do I operationalize? How do I make this thing work for me? It's one of the most common questions people ask about attack. Is this looks great, this sounds great, how do I use it? And so with that, we've tried to roll up all of those questions and answer those as part of the Purple Team exercise framework, including specific roles and responsibilities, exactly who's going to do what. And so the idea behind this is it can be your one-stop shop for getting you through your entire first Purple Team exercise. So if for some reason you find something that is a gap in there, please let us know. We're always happy to talk about it. And cybersecurity is a changing field, so we always recognize there's room for improvement, there's room for more. But the key things here is you want to get the head of security, or as I was always told, get the highest person in the organization to sign off on the scoping and rules of engagement for even Purple Team activities, because the higher up you can get, the more responsibility that they might feel, and potentially resources that you'll get afterward with a good result. So we are going to need people that are going to be responsible for the cyber threat intelligence, as well as the red team and the blue team managers. Now, if you're an external team, like sometimes we are, this is going to take a little bit of back and forth. If you're an internal team, you might be able to get all these people in the same room all at once, and maybe at a weekly leadership meeting or something like that, and they can all sign off. You're also going to need to have a red team, not just the manager, but the operator. This could be the same person. Maybe if you're a small enough organization, you fill most of these things and can essentially put on your cyber threat intelligence hat, take it off, put on another one. And so maybe you can be the person that signs half of these. But the real role that I want to outline here, that has the hardest job of everything, because it requires just being very detail oriented and being able to drive this, is the exercise coordinator. And it's at the very bottom. You'll notice how in responsibilities, everybody's got a couple of words, and then the project manager / exercise coordinator has got 2 paragraphs worth of things. And that's because this is the person that's emceeing the entire thing. They're driving all of the conversations. They're the ones that are going to keep the Purple Team exercise going. And so this needs to be a person that ideally also isn't going to have to run red team things and also do detection engineering. Now, again, if your team's small enough and you're a single person that's trying to fight all of the hordes of adversaries at your company's door, then this may be you too. But that's where scope things down, tackle things in small, and we'll talk about that too. But overall, this is the role that is potentially going to be the most difficult. And if you are going to be the champion and driver of a Purple Team activity, this is most likely going to be the role that you get to do for at least the first one. Time requirements. This is something we always get asked. Well, how long do I need for a Purple Team? So typically we do them in at least a day for like an adversary emulation plan. However, if you are going to do a much smaller Purple Team engagement, maybe just for a specific technique or procedure, you can do an hour or 2, and you can run it, and you can walk through this process as we're going to show, and you can do that in a much smaller amount of time. So this doesn't have to be only a 6-week or only a multi-day engagement. You can do it in much smaller increments, and especially for some organizations where Purple Teaming is something that's going to be a little bit more of a fight for you to get buy-in from leadership and get buy-in from the rest of your team, I would recommend you start small, single steps, and work your way up, because as people begin to see what the value you get out of them, you're going to be able to increase your resource allocation towards it, even if that's just time. And so that's going to be how you build up to that point. So start small. Otherwise, if you do get the resources and the time, and you have full leadership buy-in to do a multi-day exercise, I'd say go for it. But overall, I'd say start small so that you can really get through the process and understand how it works, and then you can increase that complexity. Logistics. Since this is mostly, I've been at SCYTHE for, I think, like 8 or 9 months now. It's hard to keep track. But since February, basically all of the Purple Team exercises I've done have been remote. So it's worked really well. However, there's caveats, and you're going to hear me say that a lot. Basically, if you're going to do virtual, everyone that's on the call that's going to be part of either the incident response process, that's going to be part of the test process, needs to be willing and able to share their screen. This is super critical as we're going through the process, because this is how you document the people, processes, and the technologies. For instance, when we've done a purple team engagement in the past, I will showcase when I'm executing what the exact command is. I will show them my screen. I will show it executing. We'll see the result. We will then pass it on to the SOC. Maybe the tier one is going to say, all right, a new URL popped up on our firewall. It's something that was previously uncategorized. This is, at this point, I would go and double check to see that it wasn't a legitimate website. If it's not, okay, I'm going to escalate it to my level 2. And so at that point, like, they're sharing their screen, they're sharing those logs that they see, they would escalate it to the tier 2, and then tier 2 would share their screen. They would share what screens they're looking at. They'd share exactly their process for how they would go and evaluate whether that was a real intrusion or not. And so those are the types of things that are really important to making sure, if you are going to do virtual purple teams, which we have done successfully now for a while, that you do need to have engagement. And so it feels sometimes a little odd at first to ask somebody like, hey, share your screen, show us the different interfaces you're looking at, dashboards that are helping you make this decision, because one side effect of going through this for purple teams is that, especially when you're doing some of those like level 2, level 3 SOCs, or you have a couple of teams that are all involved, they may show a dashboard that somebody else didn't know existed. This did happen. And so somebody's like, oh, where's that dashboard? That would help me with my job. And oh, there we go. We help make a connection. And so that's the byproducts that you get from purple teaming that aren't even outlined in what we're going through here, is that you're helping foster and showcase what a collaborative security culture can look like between teams, even if it is multiple teams from the same organization that should work together. When they're all in the same room, or they're all on the same call and sharing screens, they can really see, oh, here's how we can blend and add to our workflow. So that's just something I like to highlight. And so overall, that's what we've done. We've done Zoom ones. We've and I assume, as we continue to pick travel back up and that kind of thing, we'll have a lot of in-person ones as well that'll get everyone in the same conference room so they can share their screens. Target systems is another question we often get. Well, I want to do a purple team, but I'm going to do it in a lab environment. That can be great, except you're not actually going up against all of the defensive controls and security controls that are in the production environment, which is a problem from two points. One is that it's not going to have that entire defensive stack. So certain techniques may work in that environment that would not work in your production environment, which is going to it's going to pollute the testing. But the other thing is, the flip side of that is that there's no noise. There's no users doing things in the background, stuff like that. And so you may write a detection that says, all right, this was super easy to target. Anything that runs on Windows command line, we're going to flag and we're going to alert on it. And it's going to be a high alert. And if you ran that in your real environment, you would be flooded. There'd be 10,000 alerts in the first hour. And you're like, nope, we got to turn this off, or we have to tune it to be a little bit more specific than that. And that's what's really important about testing in production, is that you have all of those nuances that you capture as part of the test process. It is super important. And that's why we always say test in production. And that's where you'll see, when we go through the lab, you will get to test ransomware in a production environment. Pretty cool. Well, in our lab environment, but you can see how we do ransomware emulations in production environments. So we typically recommend also doing like endpoints and servers, because they tend to have different defensive stacks on them. Servers tend to be a little bit more locked down, at least in our experience. And so that's something that it means, though, that because those are assumed to be more locked down, actually it might have additional techniques will potentially be undetected, because there's an assumption that those servers are in good shape, and because they have a different defensive stack. So just something I like to highlight. Test what you can, but that's sort of my general advice there. All right. There we go. All right. So slides moving ahead for me. Scoping your test, the cyber kill chain. Most people I mentioned are familiar with this. This is why I bring this one up. It sounds cool. It's the kill chain. What we're focusing on with at least the purple teaming we're going to talk about today is at the very end, is the last two. It's that assumed breach, because this is where that business impact happens. This is where ransomware happens. Instead of worrying about what specific 0 days or things ransomware has, assume that somebody will potentially get into your network with enough time, effort, money, resources. People are going to get in one way or another. The question is, can you detect them once they are there? And can you boot them out, essentially? And so that's where, this is where you have the most control, the most visibility as a defender. And so this is where we want to do the majority of our testing. And so that's the last two steps. It's command and control, which of course, sort of the network-based part of this, and then of the actions on objectives. And so that's where one of the criticisms of the cyber kill chain is that these are actions on objectives is a really broad umbrella for all the things that can happen underneath it. And so what we'll do is sort of dive into all the different things with that. MITRE attack is one way to do it, just to jump ahead a little bit. But there's a lot that can happen in that area. So there's a lot of testing that can happen here. So it's very, if you've got most of your testing, if you're a very mature organization, maybe you can start moving out and moving left. But I would highly suspect that most organizations are going to fit in these last two spaces. So start here. If you get really good at all of that, then you can start to move to other phases. So this is what a general exercise flow looks like. We've got the exercise coordinator I mentioned. This is the MC, the person that's going and starting things off. They're going to present the adversary. They're going to work with some of the red teamers to make sure they understand the TTPs and the technical details. Now, what does this mean, technical details? This means like, how is it executed? Because that matters. If it's command line versus PowerShell, if you're using Win32 API calls, those are all going to matter with how people are going to be able to detect things and whether they're going to be able to detect things. So the second step, this is another critical one. So the exercise coordinator is going to present all of that and then ask the SOC, the blue team, what do you expect is going to happen when we run this technique, when we run this test? And most of the time, there's going to be some thinking, there's going to be maybe some discussion, and they're going to say, this may log, but this is not something that is going to cause an alert or a detection right off the bat. We need more information, right? Maybe further on in the tests. If you're just running something like IP config, which is gathering network information, that in and of itself isn't inherently malicious. So we're going to wait to see if something else more malicious comes up first. And so that's your first data point. And this is where I talked about metrics before. To really get drill down into metrics, you need some data to work with. This is your first set of data that you're gathering, is the tabletop discussion. And you are doing this for every single technique. Once that's done, your red team executes it, and then the blue team is going to have the ability to go and do that trace, see if they can find it within the logs. If an alert does come up, then they can look for it, and that's where they can do some detection engineering if they want. Now, I will admit that in a lot of organizations, detection engineering either is a separate process, a separate team, and it just takes more time to do that change management. And so oftentimes this may be something that gets essentially added to a list of things to do afterward, and we would move on to the next one. And so if you could implement detection engineering, for instance, if you are doing this and you're just doing a single TTP, then maybe you can say, all right, we're going to spend the next 20 minutes trying to write a detection. We're then going to push it in to see if it'll detect, and then we're going to run the test again. And that's what this exercise flow is. So we've outlined really the roles and goals. And then now we have, here's how you do exactly the entire exercise right here is these 6 steps. So we've gone through our exercise framework. Congratulations, you've made it through the initial purple team exercise framework. Now let's jump into creating a cyber threat intelligence based adversary emulation plan. And so we need an emulation plan. We need CTI for that. So let's talk about different types of cyber threat intelligence. This has been in a ton of different presentations. You may have seen it before. David Bianco created it back in 2013, which is even more impressive when I give you the timeline in a minute for MITRE attack. And so this was the different things, the pyramid of adversary pain. And so can you inflict pain on your adversaries by being able to incorporate these types of CTI into your environment? So hash values. So you look at this, you can look at this from red and blue side, and that's why we've got our purple pyramid here. From the blue side, it's super easy for most organizations to take in indicators of compromise, which are most of the time hash values or IP addresses, and take them in, put them in on a list of do not connect. And if you see this in our environment, it's a known malicious hash. And so if those things pop up, really easy for them to detect. However, on the flip side, the red side, adversaries, it is super easy to change these things. Hash values are something that with all of the modular frameworks these days, it's super easy to change hash values. It's really easy to change IP addresses. And even if we move up to domain names with cloud infrastructure, it is super easy to change those things. Because as we've built all of these tooling for automation in the IT realm of things, adversaries have also gained the ability and adopted using those same provisioning tools to scale up their own adversary infrastructure. And so this is where we start moving up to the top 3 of the pyramid. Network and host artifacts. This is where I like to remind people that adversaries are people too. And so what I mean by that is adversaries have resource constraints. They have deadlines. It's not an amorphous blob of expertise that sometimes people think it is. Adversaries have experts that they have to rely on in order to come code their special malware. And from that standpoint, if you start messing around with those experts' knowledge, for instance, network and host artifacts, say they have somebody that knows really well how to work within Windows temp files, or this recycle bin was another common one from APT3. And all of a sudden you start putting detections on the recycle bin. And now they have to come and change what they're doing to not use the recycle bin anymore. And so they potentially have to retool. That's pretty annoying. And that's where, as you can see, if we start messing with the tools they're using and detecting on different tools that they've developed, again, if you can start booting adversaries out based on those tools, they're going to have to go and retool, recreate those. That takes time, effort, energy, resources. And ideally, this is where you're getting to the point where adversaries don't want to target you anymore because you are a pain. And that is where we get to the very top, which is TTPs, which is adversary behaviors. And this is really tough for defenders to write detections for, but it's also really tough for adversaries to adjust this. I mentioned this before. If you have somebody that's really good at understanding exactly how to execute specific things in Windows command line, and then all of a sudden somebody came to that person and said, you can't execute anything on command line anymore. You're banned because now we have all these detections against it. You have to use PowerShell. Well, maybe they can pick up PowerShell quickly, but it's a new thing they got to learn. They have to learn how PowerShell works. They have to learn how to accomplish those same goals. And so that shift takes time. And then when you take into account that all of those behaviors essentially have to trickle back down this pyramid and all of the other things they're doing, that is going to impose a lot of pain onto adversaries. And so that's something I just like to highlight. That's how to think about this pyramid. And this is where you want to get to the top, especially when you're doing purple team activities. You may reveal when you're doing them that you're actually closer to the bottom than you were hoping for, but it gives you a really nice structured way to move up. So this looks like the cyber kill chain, but it is slightly different in that this is how we build adversary emulation plans. And so this is based off of a great talk called Attacking the Status Quo by 2 of my former colleagues, Katie Nichols and Cody Thomas, that it's just brilliant. It's great. Highly recommend you check it out. The idea behind this is that you're going to understand the target organization. You identify an adversary that they're worried about or that's targeting their industry. You gather some cyber threat intelligence. You extract out the TTPs out of them because we do want to be at the top of that pyramid. We then analyze and organize these because order of operations does matter when you are doing testing. And so with that, you're going to create a plan and then you're going to execute. And so this is the steps we're going to go through when we are trying to build this out. Now, we may have, when we're talking about it, understanding the target org, that's going to be different for every single organization. And identifying an adversary, again, going to be tough to do. So how do we do some of these things? Well, first, what we're going to do is work with MITRE attack. So this is an old version of attack because it goes, and that's because they're pushing out a new version. I think they did last week. And so it updated a couple of things. But the idea behind this is that this is a library for you to go and reference. This has across the top, you have the tactics. That's at the across the very top here. These, I forget how many there are now. I think there's like 16 maybe different tactics. And it is the objective that the adversary is trying to achieve. So this is that really high level goal: reconnaissance, defense evasion, privilege escalation. And then underneath each of those is going to be your techniques. This is the means by which the adversary achieves that goal. And so, for instance, if we go like to discovery and they're trying to discover something about the file system, you've got file and directory discovery underneath that. And then they have sub techniques, which are when even certain techniques are a little even too broad. There's a bunch of different things underneath it. They'll have sub techniques, and then procedures is the most detailed level. And that's going to be how exactly that specific technique is accomplished by an adversary. So I highly recommend. There's a ton of great resources on attack out there. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that for you all to dive more into. What you should know is that everything in attack is based on real world adversary behaviors. And that is really key, because it means that you're not just looking at attacks that are potentially a research project, which there's nothing wrong with those, but they haven't been used in a real compromise. And that's something that's really important when you're trying to scope down what you want to test, is you want to make sure that what you are testing is what the adversaries are trying to do right now. And once you get past that, then you can focus on what they might do next. So Attack Navigator is a really great tool. There's a bunch of different, it's essentially a visual communication of what you're going to test or what you're going to detect based on attack. Most EDRs and a lot of defensive tools now map to attack on the different techniques that they detect and the depth at which they try and detect them. So I highly recommend you all check that out. There's also, when you're doing testing, adversary emulation especially, we overlay what these things are. And so you can do multiple layers, you can do multiple colors. There's a lot of really cool things here that you can do to communicate exactly how you're using attack. And so it's a free tool. MITRE released it. It's great. I highly recommend checking it out. And again, this is going to be resources that I'm going to say there's more time and effort that you can spend on this outside of the Purple Team activity class. So analyze and organize. We've talked, just to do a quick recap of where we're at. We've had to choose an organization. So this is, you can do your mental model. You choose what organization you're worried about. Is it financial? Is it pharmaceutical? Is it defense? Those are a couple different options. And you can go to the attack website, attack.mitre.org, and you can search those words at the very top. And that's the easiest way to do it. And they will give you a list, and you can see different groups that have done that. And you can go and click on those groups and see specific activities and techniques that they've done. And so this is how you start to build that. So at that point, we'll have chosen an adversary, and we've gathered cyber threat intelligence through MITRE attack, because MITRE attack is those behaviors that we are trying to tackle, because we want to inflict the most pain on our adversaries. And so that's where we come to analyze and organize. Order of operations matters, and the MITRE attack team will tell you it is not a kill chain, which is true. However, you can use tactics from a high level perspective of trying to figure out the methodology that adversaries are using. Do they typically do defense evasion first? Some adversaries that are very focused on operational security are super focused on exactly how they're being detected, what defensive controls are in the environment, etc. And so that's where they are going to do defense evasion first thing, where others are going to be more focused on achieving an objective, might be it's stealing IP, things like that. And so they're going to be focused on exactly how to find and gather that information, because they don't really care if they're caught, if by the time that they're caught and kicked out, they've already achieved what they wanted. So this is where the order of operations does matter. Now, where would you go to start with some of these things? This is Threat Thursdays. It's the largest public library of adversary emulation plans. We do release them for free for everyone to look at. Scythe customers can leverage them within Scythe with a couple of clicks. And so you'll get to see exactly how we do that. But the idea behind these is that we cite the cyber threat intelligence we're using to build our plans, because we recognize that people might have their own cyber threat intelligence sources, whether it's private or their own communities or their own organizations. And we say, here's what we have, here's the plan we built on, and we provide those as a way for people to at least work off of from a blueprint. Highly recommend you check them out. And we also try and just give a quick set of detections and suggestions for them as well. So keep on the lookout. We release at least one of those a month, and that's something that we'll be continuing to release throughout the rest of the year and next year, and we're going to keep going. So check them out. We've got a bunch of different ransomware threat actors that you'll see and get to play around with in the lab. Now, what I'm going to showcase is for Orangeworm, this is just what a breakdown could look like. We've got a high-level description that just shows what organizations it's targeting, as well as the different techniques. And so we just list them off here. This is something that, depending on what you might want to test, this may be an overview of all the things you're eventually going to test, and you're only going to test one at a time. That's completely okay. This is just a way to continue down that process. And as you do more purple team activities, you'll figure out exactly what level of detail you need in each of these. And so it's going to be up to you. So we have now done analyze and organize. We have our cyber threat intelligence cited. We have our emulation plan. We have our framework. Now, how are we going to execute this? And what are we going to do for actual, tools to execute some of these things? Oh, one second. Technical difficulties. All right. So with that, we've got recording and reporting, a couple different things. Almost every analyst I know with, it feels like they start with Excel. So I can't leave Excel out, because it's sort of the trusted, it's there. Everyone pretty much has it or knows how to use it, or some sort of spreadsheet application. Now we have a couple that are more specific to purple teaming and testing. One of those is Vector. Vector is a free tool. It's not open source, but it is free for you all to play around with. And then we have Plex Track. It's been sort of a newer player to this game over the past year or two. And they are a paid tool, but that is their focus, is on reporting and templating things out. And so that's where I like to highlight. We do have some integrations with them. They're really cool. And so I highly recommend checking all of these options out and seeing what works for you. This is a quick, slightly pixelated screenshot of Vector and showcase. You can see the red team side of things. You can see the blue team side of things. The nuance here that's important is you have whether things were detected, not detected. You can tag specific tools, and that red team side has all of those details that the exercise coordinator would need to fill these out. Now, one way to speed some of this up that you'll see is that Scythe fills out this left-hand part for you, which is kind of nice. Because when you are doing this reporting, when you are the exercise coordinator, it's going to take time, effort, energy to put all these things together. This is what Plex Track looks like. It's also got essentially a breakdown of the specific procedures. You can click on them. You can say, I want the same, similar to Vector, in that you can tag specific techniques. You can say whether it was blocked, logged, not logged, and then you can put additional notes and screenshots and put all of those in, and then you can export it out. So that is something that, like I said, recommend trying a bunch of these, see what works best for you. So lessons learned. This is a huge thing of what the exercise coordinator has to essentially do at the end of each day. And so you are going to be building these things out. You're going to be taking notes and screenshots the entire time that you're going through this process. You need to not only note what specific technical controls were engaged or alerted, but also the process that the team walked through. And that's something that this can be a lot to take in the first time you do an exercise coordinator role. So I recommend having somebody that's done it before, if you can. If not, just know that maybe you're not going to gather all the information you need the first time. That's okay. Part of this is it's a learning process. You may learn that you actually want more information than I'm outlining here, or less. And there's very specific things that are going to matter to your chain of command, your senior leadership team. And those are really important contextual environmental things that you're going to know about your organization that I could never put in the slide because they're going to be different for everyone. And I highly recommend you gather feedback from people. This is something that it may take some extra conversations, but trying to understand what did people get out of this. Most of the time when we've done purple team exercise, and as soon as we ask for feedback, people are happy to sort of jump in and say, oh, I would like to do this next time, or I think we should focus on this area more. Or they might give you positive feedback, which also happens too, about all the things that they did that or they weren't familiar with that they now are, because you did this exercise. And this is where the ideal thing is, because you as the exercise coordinator are documenting things as you go along, because you have to, you basically have the report already in a format by the end of the day, because you've taken all these notes. And that's where using tools like Plex Track and some of those other ones can help you speed up the process of that turnaround from the end of the day. But ideally, you do want to get a report out and you have most of the information. So that's at least one of the positive things, is at least coming from a red team background, I'd been on my share of engagements where we essentially took sort of notes the whole week. And then at the end of it, we're like, oh, we got to try and like figure out how all these things go together into a narrative and a report that we want to give. And so that's the nice thing about purple team exercises, is that's sort of done for you. So let's talk about emulation tools. C2 Matrix. This is an open source project. Highly recommend you check it out. It is essentially an Excel spreadsheet. I mentioned that before. It has all of these different C2 profiles that people have created and open source. Some of them have changed names over the years or continue to update. There are some paid tools on here too, including like Cobalt Strike and Scythe. And these are the types of things that are going to help define what you're going to be able to test. And this may be different for you based on exactly what you are trying to test or what you've been familiar with in the past. So I'd recommend checking it out. They have a little like 10-question questionnaire to get you started that you can go and select what types of things you're looking for. And that will help you at least get your initial start. But I highly recommend checking this out. There's a lot of red teamers and other folks in the community that have put a lot of hard work into some of these. And so if you aren't able to, if you don't have a large budget, this is a good place to start. So let's talk about SCYTHE. SCYTHE is an enterprise grade platform for adversary emulation. And you're going to get to dive into this, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. The key things I want you to take away, though, is that we try and make it easy or easier to run adversary emulation plans, as well as run them repeatedly over and over again. And so that you can do it consistently, and you can do that with the confidence that this is a tool that's built to run in enterprise environments. That is something that we've heard, and I heard in the past when I initially worked on Caldera, is that people were worried about whether or not it could run an environment. And it's like, well, it is a research tool. We are building it with the intent that it is there to be helpful, but it may not be to a level of confidence that you would want to run in your production environment. That's a call that only you can make. And so again, just passing on info that and conversations that I've had in the past. And so that's something that I really like to emphasize with SCYTHE. However, you'll get to play around with it. I'm not too worried about that. So we are now done with our exercise checklist. So we're going to put it all together and go through a quick mock purple team engagement step by step, and then you'll dive into the lab. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. We've already reviewed this. Let's go into step one. Present your TTP. This one's pretty straightforward. It's just gathering the host name, and we're running this with the command line. We have our cyber threat intelligence that we pulled from our MITRE attack matrix. And then we have a couple of blanks essentially for the expected result and the expected response. So the next step would be to ask, what is the expectation? That there would be logging of the command and parameters. However, there's going to be no alert. And basically we're expecting to get this from sysmon because we've deployed sysmon. Also, sysmon is free. If you don't deploy sysmon, I always recommend trying it out. I know folks at times have said it sends so much data and so many logs. I think I've got it in here to start with either Olaf's setup he's got a modular sysmon. That's what it's called. I was looking for that word. So he's got a modular sysmon setup that you can work with. There's also Swift on Security has a really good and really well documented sysmon configuration file. Highly recommend you check both of those out because those are really good starting points and will help you get rid of a lot of noise. But since this is our result, we've completed step 2. We're now going to execute it. And so this is you're going to get to see this in Scythe. This is what happens. We executed the request, cmd/c host name. So the question becomes what happened? And we have a timestamp. We can then see and ask the blue team, all right, what's your process? How would you detect it? We have a screenshot here of Elastic because we have the elk stack set up in the environment for you all to at least play around with and at least see what this would look like. You look for the process ID, the PID. That's something at least in Scythe. That's one of the things I like to give the blue team to work from is, can you show me what's happening with this process ID that is going to be running all of these things? This is where we go through that handoff process, going through the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Something else to know is try and record how long it took from that initial execution to when the TTP showed up in the logs. Not necessarily an alert, but that's another good metric to get because time is really important. We've had multiple times where organizations have had really good teams and have had either multiple hours or several hours between when something was executed versus when it was logged. And so even the best team is going to be really challenged to tackle some of these sophisticated adversaries if they have to wait a couple hours behind them in order to start. And this is where we do that screen share. And I mentioned Olaf before, and this is this detection engineering cycle. So after we've gone through that process, and we don't want to do detection engineering, Olaf has a lot of really good resources that he's published. Again, highly recommend you check him out. There's his Twitter handle in the bottom right. And we can go really quickly through his whole engineering life cycle here. So we're going to hypothesize, can we detect this? And let's see. Oh, I skipped ahead. Let's see if I can go back here without, oh. All right, I promise I'll make this work. There we go, hypothesize. We're just saying, can we detect command line? And then can we detect specific command line arguments? This is something that may seem straightforward to some of you, but there are some tools that will say, we saw command line ran, and that is the level of detail you get. And so that's where detecting specific arguments is a separate thing. You also have your attack technique ID there that you can use to see, is this something that we think we will be able to detect as well? Because as I mentioned, a lot of different EDRs, a lot of different defensive tools are linking to attack now. So you may be able to see whether or not you already detect on this or not based on just what that vendor's release. So I highly recommend you all check that stuff out. All right, next. Oh, all right, I'll get this. And if it's changing on your screen, but not mine, I apologize. You get to see me jump through a couple slides. So here we go. Can we detect command line? We're going to look at the data sources that we would need in order to do this. And this is where attack has continued to update that. That has been a key thing this year, is that they've really wanted to make it easier to write detections based on attack techniques. And all the data sources that are available are where you get that first data to do analysis for detections. And so we can see here that we do for host name specifically. So this is for that specific, I think, T1087. And we're looking at, can we detect these specific arguments? Where do we get these? Is it going to be sysmon? It's going to be Windows event logs. Is it going to be our EDR agent? And so in this case, it's going to be the sysmon logs that we had. And because that was what our primary data source was, because that's where we're starting off. All right. Man. All right. Developing analytics. So do we look for all new processes coming from cmd.exe? This is the first time if you're writing a detection, you're like, yes, anything with cmd.exe. And then you get flooded. There's just too much stuff. It's like, well, do we look for anything with host name in it? that might get you this command, but it also might be a little bit too over engineered. And so this is where you have the difficulty and the challenge of trying to figure out what is enough of a breakdown so that you're not bringing in too much stuff and too much data that you're not going to be able to act on it. And you're going to have too many false positives. So you don't see anything that is true, but you also need it to not be so specific that any change by an adversary is going to bypass it, and means that you're going to be essentially tackling detections the same as indicators of compromise. If they run this exact thing in this exact way, we'll detect it. But if they change literally anything about that, then it's going to break. And so that's where we have here, if you look, we're casting a wide net, all processes from cmd.exe, and how can you narrow it down? And so try and be as efficient as possible. You're going to have to try things out. This is not going to necessarily be a perfect process from the start. Research. So do you want to look at just building detections based on this single command? The answer is probably no, because this is executed by itself. Maybe a sysadmin or maybe a tool that you've installed does this already. And that's something that you need to be cognizant of, is this type of stuff might be happening in your environment and it might be benign. And that's the challenge, again, with all this in writing detections. And so trying to figure out, can we add more data to this? Is there more context that we can add? Maybe if it's a brand new executable that's never been seen, that's then running this, well, that could be suspicious. Or maybe no one actually runs cmd/c. If anyone runs hosting, it's going to be a sysadmin typing it out from a command line that they've spawned themselves. So there are some nuances and differences in there that can provide you additional context that will allow you to say, this is malicious, this is not, but it does require time, effort, energy, and tuning. And then, of course, report and revise. This is where we're tying back into the Purple Team exercise framework, because this is where you as the exercise coordinator are going to be bringing things in and recording it. So here's the final results of our single procedure. We have a verified result that sysmon logging of command and parameters through event ID 1, and there was no alert. So this met expectations. Even though there was an alert, that's okay. That's something I want to emphasize. You aren't going to be able to alert on everything. And if you are, your SOC will get overwhelmed. You will get overwhelmed, and that's not what we want to. We don't want to add any more burnout to anyone, because you need people to be sharp in order to actually catch and boot out real adversaries. So again, we're going to repeat per procedure, and you would run through all of this again. And so what's next? The purple maturity model. This is where I'm going to touch a little bit on the strategy of how we move from a detection understanding and threat understanding. This is if you want to implement a purple team within your organization. This is what we're doing here at SCYTHE. This is we're building out a purple team. It's not a blue team. It's not a red team. It has people from both backgrounds. And this is how you're going to measure your maturity. Deployment being level 1. This is going to be your where you're deploying someone else's tools. Integration is going to be where you're combining multiple tools you've deployed for greater effect. And then creation is, of course, sort of the pinnacle of each of those, is that you're able to create contextual, nuanced, new detections, new tests in order to help you adapt to real world adversaries. And I have a specific blog post that goes into this. We have most of the teams that we do engagements for have a lot more detection understanding than they do threat understanding. And that's what I'd highly recommend you check that out. And with that, it's hands-on time. Also, we have a swag store. You can buy swag and save the chubby unicorns. Unicorn is the SCYTHE logo you can see here. And we have just released our fall collection. So I highly recommend you check it out. Just if you want some of the coolest swag. We were at B-Sides Augusta this month. I guess it was technically this month. And